Hello, welcome to Science Friday Educate. This is Science Friday's live panel discussion on climate change education and bringing climate science into the classroom. So thank you for joining us. My name is Sochi Garcia, and I am Science Friday's Education Program Assistant. So basically at Science Friday, I'm responsible for helping to support teachers with free educational resources, professional development, and coordinating events like the one we're doing today. So on March 18th, Science Friday did a segment on climate education, and we wanted to continue that discussion with education practitioners. So we have brought together a panel of experienced educational professionals to talk with you about climate education today. So throughout the discussion, you can tweet your questions with the hashtag SciFriClimate, or you can use the Q&A feature in Google Hangouts to submit a question for us to ask our panelists. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to our panel. So joining us today, we have Regina Brinker, who is a science teacher with the Livermore Valley Joint Unified School District in Northern California. Regina has been teaching science to students in middle school for over 14 years, and most recently she spent 3 weeks in the Arctic studying the release of CO2 from permafrost through the Polar Trek program. So hello, Regina.
Hi, Zoshi. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Also joining us today, we have Dr. Lisa Gardner. Lisa leads K-12 formal education at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, UCAR, and at their Center for Science Education. And this center brings science of climate change, weather, and the Earth system into classrooms through engaging educational resources and professional development for teachers. Lisa has been creating educational resources and working with teachers for over 15 years, and you may know her as the illustrator of NASA's Elementary Globe K-4 storybooks. So hello, Lisa. Welcome to our panel today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Additionally, joining us, we have Cheryl Manning, who is the president-elect of the National Earth Science Teachers Association, and she's a high school science teacher in Evergreen, Colorado. Cheryl has been teaching climate science at the high school level for the last 15 years in earth and space science and both AP environmental science and chemistry courses. She also works with teachers to incorporate the principles of climate and climate change through all the sciences. So we'd like to welcome Cheryl to our panel today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And our final panelist tonight is Frank Neopold. And Frank is the Climate Education Coordinator at NOAA's Climate Program Office in Maryland and a co-chair of the U.S. Global Change Research Program's Education Interagency Working Group. And at NOAA, he develops and implements NOAA's climate goal education and outreach efforts. Frank was also a middle school and high school earth science teacher for 10 years. And Frank is going to start us out by giving us some perspective on changes and needs in climate education. So thank you for joining us, Frank.
Thank you so very much for letting us have this opportunity together with teachers across the nation and maybe even beyond. So I was asked to join NOAA. I was working at NASA and the GLOW program as a classroom teacher, and they asked me to join them to really, they knew that education was going to be a huge priority for what we were doing with climate way back in 2005. Feels like a long time ago. But I think back then, climate was not a really central part of education in the nation. There were a lot of pieces, but since then, we, the community of educators, formal, informal, college, high school, elementary, place-based, informal, formal, have really risen to that space and grown a focus and a diversity and a maturation in this that is really quite impressive. Part of my job is to coordinate that and to facilitate it and nurture it and be impressed by it. So, you know, it's really quite a wonderful thing. I think that, you know, while we've had some challenges, and there's always challenges in doing something really complex, really challenging, really substantial, mean, one of the things I'm impressed with climate education is it just sprawls into all disciplines, all topics. It just keeps on going. Every time I've tried to get my hands around it, it just creeps a little bit more. And the amount of work to support teachers and educators and students, just let's remember that 1 in 4 people in the nation is a student. That bears repeating. 1 in 4 people in the nation is a student. Something in the order of 76 million people in the nation are a student. And that means the scale of what we're talking about is, 15,000 school districts and, about 3 million teachers of science. It really makes it challenging to envision how we would operate on such an important issue. It requires dedicated programs, which we're having a hard time getting going and sustaining over that long time. But, I mean, looking forward, I work with the White House on a climate education and literacy initiative and work with a lot of partners, and the potential is just huge. And I think that experience we've had over the last decade, if you look forward, it's full of opportunity and excitement, and while there are challenges, I think those are the small thing to focus on. I think the bigger thing to focus on is this. And if you've ever been with a student or somebody in an informal institution, they're looking at this issue and you see the inflection that as they start really looking at this seriously. But younger people really, they pivot into a very positive space very quickly. And now that the challenges are really quite substantial, more substantial than most people understand. But what we're going to do about it and prepare to do about it, that's where a lot of students are, and that's what keeps me excited to be in this job and work with colleagues like those you've assembled and work with you as well. And the partnerships keep on going, and so I'm really excited to be here with you. Maybe I should just transition into one of the pieces of that. Is that what we've learned over the last 11 or so years is contact time matters. A lot of people, when you talk about climate education, they have an idea that it's a small unit, maybe a week long in middle school, 7th grade, and that's climate change, and we're done. That couldn't be farther from the truth. This is something that builds from solid foundations in, say, kindergarten, all the way up through, middle school, high school, college, lifelong learning. It's really it's a really much more mature, substantial, and it sprawls well beyond the earth sciences, which is where I was trained, into the other sciences, and then also into other disciplines in the school. And informal and place-based is critical here. So the learning it's bigger than STEM. It's critical to STEM, but it's bigger than that. And I think that's that integration of learning is a wonderful opportunity. That is we're just getting into the beginning of really appreciating how that works. It's challenging, don't get me wrong, but it is exciting and important. And when we do it well, that's what we're trying to figure out how to share across the nation and beyond. So probably I should stop there and let others.
Awesome. I actually wanted to hand it over to Lisa Gardner. I wanted to have you kind of talk about some of this idea of contact time matters. And we talked a lot about integrating climate change education across the disciplines. And so just kind of what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I've been hearing from teachers some interesting examples of, especially at schools where, say, in a middle school team, the team teachers from different disciplines are working together. So that presents a bit of an opportunity to have a theme that you're looking at through different lenses. So you can address it through a social studies lens and look at how decisions are made about how our energy structures are taxed or something like that. And you could look at it through a geography frame and understand land use and how that affects climate change. You could look at it through all sorts of different frames, and I think including the language arts and math skills and all of the Spanish class, it all relates. I could relate anything to climate change. It's like that game, 6 degrees of separation game. I mean, you could include it in every classroom, and I'm hearing more and more examples of that from teachers. I also know that in some schools that's not possible, but with teachers in different disciplines, who want to involve climate change in their class, in their social studies class or English language arts class, there are ways to get at that, even if you don't have a coordinated team.
Awesome. I actually want to recognize a question from Twitter that was just posted. It was from Alyssa, and she was saying, should earth science be a required, at least highly recommended course to ensure students get more climate education?
Yes.
I think you're talking to a bunch of earth scientists and earth science teachers, so yes, absolutely.
And I actually want to throw the comment over to Regina. Regina, we wanted to talk about one of the challenges being teacher access to scientists and the recent research, and I was wondering if you could share your experience with that.
Sure. Definitely having students and teachers connect with researchers and current data makes lessons more relevant and gives lessons meaning. And teachers need to get connected. A good way to start is to join professional teaching organizations such as your state's Science Teacher Association or the National Science Teacher Association or Chemistry Science Teachers Associations, but find connections there. NSTA, for example, has listservs that often there'll be opportunities where professional development is advertised or ways students to connect with each other or to connect with other scientists. Go to local and regional colleges or universities. A hint is that postdocs and researchers often need to include an educational outreach component in their grants. So you're helping researchers by giving them that connection, recognizing that many schools are not near a university or college. Go online, look, have a presence on Twitter or Google Hangout. Skype in the Classroom is an excellent way to connect people from all around the world and to your classroom. You can request speakers, but also have students become scientists, especially in middle school. Most of my work has been with middle school students. Middle school is often the first time that students have dedicated science classes, and if teachers start teaching how to do science in middle school, that's one of the tasks. Students' chances to collect data, to look at data, to work on collaborative projects, and there are international collaborative projects that students can participate in, collect local data, and then share that and analyze data and compare it to people around the world, and they become the scientists, and then they meet people in those other locations also. But it's taking this big issue, climate change, and personalizing that by giving students tools.
Thank you, Regina. I actually want to throw it over to Cheryl because we had a discussion about getting in touch with local universities and scientists and bringing them into your classroom, and I know that's something you're really passionate about. So do you want to share some of your experiences doing that as a high school teacher?
Yeah, so when I started teaching climate science, I had a pretty decent working knowledge of it compared to my peers, and I felt confident in what I was doing. Little did I know that I was getting myself into a challenging situation with some folks and parents of students, and I had to reach out to my community. I'm lucky to live in the Colorado Front Range, and I was able to reach out to people who live in this area, scientists who live in this area, and they supported me. And I really believe that as teachers, when we are not, when our depth of knowledge isn't as great as it needs to be to teach something, we need to model that curiosity and that creativity and reach out to people who may be able to help us gain that deeper knowledge of the topics we teach, because then we are able to meet the needs of our students better, and we're able to take those challenges head on. That being said, not everybody has that luxury of having colleges nearby, but I still think it's worthwhile to reach out to university college professors who are and college professors who are working on climate change in your state. I also think that it's if you can work with museums in your area, that's helpful. And then if those things are beyond your reach, get online. There are so many resources. Regina was talking about this. The listservs at NSTA are super helpful. But I also think that NOAA, NASA, National Science Teacher Association, the National Association for Geoscience Teachers, and then my organization, the National Earth Science Teacher Association, we all have resources available for teachers to find online professional development opportunities that can help further the teacher's knowledge of the subject. Many of us are teaching outside of the areas that we have degrees in, and so we have to go and seek that knowledge from elsewhere, and we have to put ourselves through that learning cycle to gain that understanding.
I was actually just going to add, in addition to that, state science, STEM directors are a great resource. So if you have a state STEM director, reaching out to them directly, getting on their radar in terms of like that they know your name and they know your email and they know you're an active educator, that goes a really long way to throwing opportunities for professional development back to your district or your local area. So I would encourage people, aside from being on the listservs. And one other thing to point out about listservs is a lot of them are tailored to your grade level. So I know NSTA, if you're an elementary school teacher, it's a great place to put up your own resources as well as share with other teachers who are in your grade range. So that's just like a really great thing to be a part of. And one of the things that we encounter a lot with climate education is communicating bad news. It doesn't seem like a very positive topic to teach a lot of times. And so, Frank, I know that you have a lot of great ideas in this regard for educators.
Sure. I mean, what we consider bad news is scientific evidence that we have an issue, and the scientific evidence on climate and climate change is overwhelming, substantial, multiple lines of investigation, reinforced. I mean, this is a very deeply substantiated problem that we are dealing with. Science is very robust. And so, the results of that is bad news in one way, but, if you understand it, what we do with that information is the good news. And building the understanding with our students, our communities, what they can do to prepare for those opportunities. I mean, that's where this is. And so, sitting in the bad news part of it misses the opportunity to actually move forward into the opportunity space, whether it's transition to a low carbon economy, which we're going to have to do, or building resilience in our communities, which we're going to have to do. But not doing it is still a choice. Being prepared for those choices makes it an opportunity. I think really that's where, when I'm working with students, that's where they want to go. One of the best questions I've ever been asked by a student working in climate was a young man, 7th grader, loved 7th grade, said, I understand what you're talking about, but does this mean all the jobs are going to change? And if you just think about what that is and where that 7th grader was coming from, and he's preparing for the future that he's anticipating, and he was hearing that he needed to think about a different future to anticipate, and he's right. But that's where the opportunity is. So I think that's the way I look at it, and that's where we as science agencies and science organizations are looking to youth to prepare for the handoff that we're going to be doing, because we're moving this way, and a lot of communities are moving this way, and so we need people to keep building on that momentum.
Cool. And Lisa?
Yeah, I had something to add to that, and I completely agree with what Frank said. But just adding on to that, that whenever you're communicating bad news about the environment, some people are going to get scared, and other people are going to get numb to it. Some people will have too many other things to worry about that they can't really deal with anything else. I mean, if you're worried about remembering your locker combination and if that guy over there likes you and all that stuff, you know, if you don't have any space to worry about anything else, then it could be just overwhelming. So acknowledging, giving students, building in time after the students have learned the science, which is very substantial, and we know what's going on, building in time so that they can reflect on that and that they can understand their feelings about it, and that takes a little time, and also understanding how their values fit with the information that they just learned. And so building in that time between sharing the bad news about the climate situation and going towards the, okay, so we can solve this, let's try to solve it together, is really important. And that might be out of class time. It doesn't need to be a discussion with everyone.
So I would like to sort of move on to this idea of best practices and amazing resources and just share the wealth of knowledge that all of you bring. Really quickly, I did want, Lisa, for you to sort of talk about this idea of elementary access in climate change education.
Right. And with you know, elementary spans a lot of grades, so we're kind of not just talking about one thing here, but building up to understanding global climate change, you need quite a bit of background. And with really young kids, say kindergarten or first grade, I'd recommend starting with weather. Going outside, using your senses to explore the weather, noticing the colors, the way weather feels, the way it sounds. And this helps students learn to appreciate weather, learn to bond with weather. And if you do it throughout the school year, then they'll notice seasonal changes, which can help them build an understanding of climate. And with older elementary students, so say grades 3 through 5 or something like that, they're expanding their horizons beyond their local environment. They're ready to learn about regional climates, how the climate in Costa Rica is different from the climate in New York City, and that kind of thing. And so their understanding of regional climates, that's an important step towards understanding global climate change. So, and they're also learning, it's a great time to start to learn about the Earth as a system, that the life and the air and the water and the land are all interconnected, and that we humans have impacts on all those things. And all those things have impacts on us, and so cause and effect are a great thing to bring up. And yes, some of those impacts are negative, and so like we've been saying, it's great to start out with the science. For instance, how like melting ice on land adds water to the ocean. That's just the science, you know, not thinking at first about how that'll affect people and animals and that kind of thing, and then considering how it'll affect people and animals when it's time to think about how we're going to tackle those problems. Can we move people? Can we make floating houses? What can we do? And so, and this is something at UCAR we've been thinking about quite a lot this year, because we've been working with NASA Langley to develop a new elementary globe unit about climate change. So that is not available yet, but this is definitely a subject that I think is very needed.
And so that does bring us, we're going to move on to talking about best practices and sharing amazing resources that everybody on the panel has used over the years. And I do want to go to a comment from Lei on Twitter, basically helping students use data and evidence and to become critical consumers of information is job number one in climate education. And I just thought that was like a really good highlight to some of the things that we're emphasizing, is that you should ground students in the science, like Lisa was saying. I do want to talk to Cheryl now about ensuring that students understand the process, which is sort of alluded to by that comment becoming critical consumers, understanding the science and the background. Hello?
All right. Yeah. Sorry. I think that I want to build off of what Lisa was saying. It really starts with making sure that students understand the role of observation in science, and that starts at the very earliest grades. The new next generation science standards, they're not so new now, but the emphasis on the practices that that creates a more scientific way of thinking about the world. Yes, we start with data, we start with observations, but it's not just one set of data or one observation, it's many. I am a geologist by training. Are you guys getting reverberation?
Yeah, a little feedback.
It's okay.
Okay.
Let's just switch to Frank really quickly, and then Cheryl, we'll get back to you in a second. So Frank, in terms of NGSS, emphasis on scientific thinking and ensuring that students know the process, I know we talked a lot about like this grounding in science being a really important thing for students coming in.
Absolutely. I mean, and what Cheryl was alluding to with these new standards, whether they're next generation science centers or modified or adapted, really doesn't matter. But the focus on the process, but the underlying data that allows you to really dig into this deeply. We're in a lovely country for this because our access to data here is really unprecedented. We have petabytes of data available. Getting into it with students is there are better initiatives and programs and federal agencies like mine at NOAA, but also my fellow agencies and NASA are also doing a lot of initiatives to open up the data that we have to allow students to really dig in with the tools to build the skill with the real data that we use to assess climate. In a lot of different ways, a lot of different types of, and then also the modeling outputs. So, we're talking huge data sets, but that's a wonderful thing that I know this administration's been working on extensively to open up that data. Not all of it is available, but we're making a lot of progress. So, websites like data.gov is one place, but then you need the tools to be with students to be able to go in there and really do that analysis. And then obviously the products of that, like the National Climate Assessment, things that you can know that have been really reviewed and you can access with your students regardless of where they are in their learning progression. So I think that making your pathways to those trusted sources and then really opening up the skill space with students is a critical piece of this.
And I know we had a comment from Jackie Gerstein off of Twitter, and what she is saying is that making students critical consumers of science begins with learning how to do observations and to really observe the natural world. And I think, Lisa, that was one of the things that you talked about, but also Regina, in your teaching practice, I know that that's a critical component of what you do is getting kids out into nature.
Definitely. For students to have interest and engagement in any lesson, whether it's climate or not, they really have to find meaning in the lesson, and that's the teacher's job, to give lessons meaning. And I think the best way to craft that meaning is to show a local application or personal applications. Have students outside collecting data, as has been mentioned, and building different lessons and activities that can relate to climate change maps, can relate to heat maps. For example, students can go outside and take surface temperature measurements and compare the blacktop to concrete to grass to dirt, and look at those temperatures. And wherever you're living, you'll find differences. Urban settings are important to get kids outside too. You don't have to be in a suburban or rural area where you have a big garden or park by you. But if you're in an urban setting, you can go out and look at heat islands. You can create models where you're looking at different colors of roofs in urban settings and how do those reflect light and reflect heat, or absorb light and heat. But definitely getting students outside, collecting data, and as they do that, they learn how to follow protocol for collecting data, how to report data and share it. But definitely place-based learning, giving meaning to what the lessons mean for them, for their community. And this gives a chance to empower students. We started talking about the bad news, but the good news is that when you talk about lessons on greenhouse gases, have students do energy surveys in their school and in their house. How can they decrease their own energy use at school? If you're empowering students to become those leaders of turning out the lights when people leave the classroom, recycling more, they feel like they can make a change. And small things like that will get students engaged and interested, and you'll have them caring about what's going on.
And I actually want to go back to Cheryl on this note. I know, Cheryl, we had a discussion recently about a really cool application of climate science in the chemistry classroom that you did, where students are looking at a lot of different factors, the least of which is ocean salinity. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you weave climate change science into your chemistry class? Sorry, Cheryl, are you muted? Okay, Cheryl, I think we can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. The chemistry course that I teach, I bring climate in a couple of different ways. We have a section of the course that is all around how molecules work. And when I first started teaching about climate science, I actually didn't really know how gases absorbed energy. And so I had to reach out to scientists, reach out to other people, and teach myself about how different types of gases absorb different wavelengths of energy, and how that changes the molecule's movement within, and how the layers of the atmosphere reflect that heating. And so when we're looking at the troposphere, for example, the bottom of the atmosphere, we have a higher concentration of greenhouse gases, and those greenhouse gases are absorbing the heat that's being given off by the Earth's surface. And so there's some modeling that I have my students do to show that. And I was just at the National Science Teachers Association meeting in Nashville, and I was lucky enough to encounter some people who were looking at resonance, and they gave me a whole bunch of new ideas I just walked away from, and on how to teach this, and I'm really excited to try it in my classroom. It was all work from the Exploratorium, and I think that there are a lot of different ways to model this. The other piece that I bring into my chemistry class is the ability of different types of surfaces to absorb energy, solid and liquid surfaces to absorb energy, and then that is again conveyed into the atmosphere.
I kind of want to, we have a question or a comment from Twitter from Andrea, and it's actually to Frank, and she pointed out that students can use real NOAA data to study climate, and I think that's a really interesting point if you want to expand on that.
Absolutely. You know, all agencies now have access to substantial amounts of data. So I'll give you a very concrete example. We have a project that it's an interagency project, but no one's in the lead, which is the Climate Resilience Toolkit. And in the Climate Resilience Toolkit, we've lifted up the data that's really hard to get at, put it into the browser in a much more effective way in the Climate Data Explorer, which is a part of the Climate Resilience Toolkit. And you know, that's a great tool. We have something called NOAA View, which does the same thing, where you can bring up data and look at different data patterns and trends, and that's another piece, because it's you know, just having access to the data is one thing, but really having, you know, how it connects with your practice. But if you don't have the data, then it's really hard to do that. But so I think we've committed ourselves, as have other agencies and other organizations, to pulling up more of that data and making it more available. So, you know, I think you're gonna be happy when you find those tools. obviously finding the needles in the haystack is always a trick, but we're trying to make it easier for you all the time.
So I just wanted to point people to the noaaclimate.gov website, which is a really good repository of kind of what Frank was talking about, where we can access these data, these different readings. It's a really comprehensive site that has a lot of awesome things.
Absolutely. I mean, the maps and data section of climate.gov is another a space where we've done exactly that. One of the challenges that we always have is that every map projection is a little different. The color palettes, it's a little different, and so we've been trying to make them a little bit more consistent, so it's a little bit easier. Because I mean, as a former classroom teacher, I don't like that former part, but anyway, as a teacher, trying to explain some of the projection pieces gets in the way. I mean, it's a piece of the problem, but we're trying to make things a little bit more consistent. Whether you're looking at a NOAA drought outlook, or you're looking at a seasonal outlook, or you're looking at a precipitation pattern, or we're trying to do it on our side, so it makes it easier for you to really get into the substance of the matter as opposed to the technical issues.
So one of the biggest questions that we get when we approach climate change education, and Lisa, we kind of talked about this idea of depoliticizing the teaching of climate education, and how do we as teachers engage in that practice? Lisa, I'm going to hand it over to Regina really quickly while we figure out your microphone. Regina,
I could do that.
Oh.
So how to depoliticize the issue. With students, if you give students, for example, the graph that shows temperature change and CO2 change over years, the Al Gore hockey stick graph, if you mention that, if you introduce that lesson that way, becomes automatically political. For sixth grade students, I show them the graph and I ask them to interpret it. What is it showing? When do you see changes happening? What else happened globally in those changes? And students can find answers that, students can accurately explain what graphs and data are showing, without a political bend to it, and I think that's the approach that I take. I really stick with science and stick with the data, and ask students to interpret things. And when they can see it, it's them getting it, not me telling them, but them understanding. That makes a difference.
And I think Lisa, you have a similar point in when you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, what you just described, Regina, is exactly, I think, what science teachers should be doing, is to lead with the science of how the climate system works and how the climate system is changing. And to do that through having the students use their science skills to figure it out for themselves. Have middle and high school students in particular investigate graphs of temperature or sea level data, and have them explore maps of how sea ice has changed, for instance, or the number of severe rainfall events and that kind of thing, and then use their language arts skills to make that, verbalize that. What did they find in all this, and what did they see given this information? And there's another tool that I wanted to bring up. We talked a little bit about the ways we know about climate change, and a lot of the projections into the future that you're going to show students in those graphs are using climate models. There's a very, very simple climate model, we call it, on the UCAR website, where students can ask these sort of what-if questions to see, what if we just kept adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere? What would that do to temperature? And, well, what if we stopped? What would how would that change temperature? And so they could use it as an experimental tool to understand that cause and effect. So I think that's another way, and also making sure it's clear how we know what we know about climate change, so that students understand how much data has been collected about weather over many, many years in thousands of places all over the world, through satellites more recently, and what we know, and the story of how scientists, came to this understanding. I mean, scientists figured out that carbon dioxide traps heat, over 120 years ago or something like that, and so this isn't something that a politician walked into Congress and said. This is something that's part of the process of science, and so those stories too, getting them into the picture, I think is really important. And also, although I know we all have our good bad judgments about what's going on, if we could table that and table the politics and look at what is happening, and then have a forum somewhere where students can say, well, I think that's bad, but separate it from the data itself. The data, a student once came to me a long time ago and said, oh, climate's bad. I hear climate is really bad. And I was like, well, wait a minute, climate's not bad. It just did a bad thing. And, so we we need a better way to talk about this so that, the science process it's happening. What we are doing to the system and all that, there are judgments there and there is politics to it. But if we could lead with what the climate is what's happening to climate right now, without coming to an opinion about it, but rather understanding the science, I think that's great. Another resource I wanted to share was that it really depoliticizes things if you could personalize the science of climate. And one way to do that is to get a climate scientist into your classroom, which is what Cheryl was talking about as well. There's an excellent program called Climate Voices that helps. It's kind of like a Match.com for climate scientists, or it was described to me that way anyway, but it helps make connections between climate scientists who would like to talk to people about the science and community groups, including schools, that would like to learn about it. And it's free. So, and it's a US-based program. So if you go to the Climate Voices website, there's a map where you can see if there are climate scientists in your area that will come and help talk to your students about climate change.
I wanted, and we just showed the Climate Voices website. It's climatevoices.org. And another thing we wanted to touch on in this discussion is making climate science local and relevant. And I know, Regina, that's something that you do, and Cheryl, I know that's also something you do. So I'm curious if you have any specific recommendations for teachers in terms of making climate science local and relevant.
There are some collaborative programs online that your students can become involved with. The World Water Monitoring site invites students to go out and take water samples and chemistry profiles, upload that to an international database. You can compare water chemistry, water availability around the world. I couldn't have done that with my students for the past 4 years here in Northern California because our streams were dry. We've been in a drought. There was no water to test. The streams literally were dry. Project Budburst invites to go outside and observe the time that trees start blooming, when their leaves or flowers open, and as climate changes, that budburst date has changed in some locations. You can monitor and quantify, use tools, how trees green up and green down in the autumn. But again, you can have these local programs, and then you can compare that to international groups, and maybe invite other students to connect in the United States or in your state or across the world, and compare data that way.
And Cheryl, I know you do place-based engagement as well with data collection, especially with your students. So do you want to speak to that a little?
Yes. So the first thing that I did to get my students involved in collecting data locally was through the Globe project, and then I've expanded that to include CocoRAS, which is a rain, hail, snow network, and so students keep track of how much moisture is falling in different parts of the world, and it's map data as well as archived data, and it's really interesting. Students get very engaged in that process. And
Awesome.
the last thing is I use the U.S. Geological Survey stream gauging system to keep track of the levels of water in our local rivers and streams in the mountains of Colorado.
So one of the things that's happening in our discussion online is that we have a lot of teachers offering suggestions. So one of the things that I wanted to put out there is if you are following the hashtag SciFri climate, a lot of teachers are putting their own ideas. So I just want to emphasize that the teacher community itself, I know we touched on this idea of listservs and getting involved with networks. I know cleannet.org also has a network that you can join with teachers and really get in touch with educators who are really excited about climate education and coming up with new and innovative ideas. We had a comment that I want to throw to Frank from Brian Smith on Twitter that was about how agency is key. And kids, I've taught, are hungry for truth, however dark. So to maintain positive energy and encourage action, it's good to give kids agency. And I know, Frank, you have a lot of ideas about getting kids involved.
I couldn't agree more. It's interesting agency, given I work at an agency, but I get the agency that we're referenced here. I think that's the skill, the knowledge, the empowerment. So I was part of the U.S. delegation to the Conference of Parties 21, or the COP 21, representing both education but also youth engagement, and spending a lot of time with youth from middle school all the way up through college as part of this. And if you listen to them, and there were these other youth engagement events around the world and all over the United States, and they are very active and want to spend more time on this as a subject. They want to spend more time preparing. They want to learn more about it. They want to study this subject in addition to others, but they really want that time. Like we were at that question that came up earlier about, should this be required or highly recommended? I think it's required. And that's my personal opinion. Everybody's going to tackle this in different ways. But I mean, I think if you listen to the students, they really, if they start thinking about it, they really want to dig into this much more. And what that is building agency. But they also want to be leaders. And they want that leadership to be active now, not preparing for leadership in the future, but now. And that's a critically important thing, because, I mean, if as educators, we want empowered, knowledgeable, impassioned, responsible, students, citizens, and leaders. What more do you want? And if they really are digging in deeply because they understand the importance and relevance, we all get that relevance is critical to learning. But this is where you can really get substantial focus out of your students in powerful ways that are really exactly what we, in the philosophy of education, a lot of us work from. This is it. Not to say that there aren't other ones, but I've focused on a lot of issues as a teacher, and this is really a surprisingly powerful and positive one. Once you get past the daunting aspects of it, agency is what gets you there.
So what we want to do in this last 10 minutes is actually open it up to questions from Twitter or through our Google Hangout Q&A. And so we have a couple questions here that I'm going to field to different panelists based on who wants to answer it. So I have, what age do you recommend starting climate change education and why? So Lisa?
Yeah.
I'm going to throw that question to you.
Yeah, well, and this is, there isn't one right answer to this. I think in the past with other environmental calamities, there was a sense that we need to shield kids from those because they will be scared of nature. It'll be too scary if they haven't yet developed a fondness for nature. But with the media being everywhere, kids are learning about climate change at a younger age than in the past. And so, I mean, if your students or your children are too young to grasp the science concepts that we've been talking about, but they're asking about the problems of climate change, I know it can be really tempting to dodge the question, but I don't think that's a good idea. I think that will make kids more worried because they are hearing about it. And so my answer to that, when a kid who is clearly too young to get the concept of all the greenhouse gases and where the emissions and all that, is to say, as we all know, if you make a mess, you have to clean it up. And so after many, many, many years, people all over the world made a mess in the air, but it's invisible, so we didn't worry too much about it. But now the science of that mess is more known, and we're finding ways to clean it up. And I leave it there because that ends with that we're finding ways to clean it up, and that's where kids can get involved. And even if it's just making sure their school recycling program is really up to snuff, that is very important. And I think I think it can be kids of all ages, but I'd really recommend with the very young kids to start with weather and appreciation, cloud types, that sort of thing. Make sure kids are developing that fondness for the environment before, telling them the tragedy of the polar bears and things like that. But they are hearing about these things, so please don't dodge the question. That's my personal opinion on it.
I want to shift to Cheryl now because we had a question specifically about project-based learning successes and challenges with the model of climate change education. This person is trying to do a unit on climate change next year in a project-based learning way. What would your recommendations be for that? Or how have you approached it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to approach project or problem-based learning. And there's some great resources out there, and I encourage them to investigate some of those. And I think that we've alluded to some of them. But I would say that make sure that when you're starting out with problem and project-based learning, that you are keeping it manageable for yourself, and because then if you don't, it can become a bit of a monster, and you want to keep it very manageable. Very focused. I don't give a test on climate change at the end of my climate unit. I do have a climate unit. I start teaching climate change when I talk about geologic time, but my assessment is actually what I refer to as a climate summit. And so we've learned a lot about climate. We've learned a lot about climate change, and students have examined all sorts of different kinds of data. And then they have to apply it and examine the climate and the climate change impacts in different parts of the world. So each group of students has a part of the globe that they're focusing in on. They're learning the details about that, and then they come as representatives from that part of the world. And it's almost like the summits that we've seen at Copenhagen, at Paris, and with the idea that they have to represent a part of the world that they may not live in, and they have to argue for changes. And that particular problem, it's like, if you were the people going to Paris last fall, what would you argue for? How would you defend your part of the world? That assessment, the students love. Number one, it's not a test, so they like that part of it. But they also they've continued to talk about it all year.
I also want to. Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm sorry.
Oh, I wanted to have Regina also touch on this idea of project-based learning, because I know you do a lot of place-based learning, but also project-based learning as well.
And again, at the end of several units, pretty much the end of the year for my 6th grade earth science students. I had students work individually or in a team and design a solar house that had energy-saving devices, water saving devices, and the students actually built the house, so I was pulling in that engineering part of NGSS, but they had to talk about how would they get their energy source, what powers would their house use, or their community use as an electricity source. Would they depend only on solar, on wind, on hydroelectric? What, in their location, what energy sources could they use? How would they conserve water? How would they look at insulation to help make their house more efficient? Different things like that. The students had to do a lot of research, start with background knowledge they had, and pick a climate area, then how to do a lot of research of how do you make this practical? If we're in our community, how can we move forward and, as I said, have a low carbon or zero carbon society, and how can you do that with building, and how can you create structures that don't impede the environment and don't add to climate change. And I had them design something. It took about 4 weeks. They actually did build a structure. I was lucky enough through a grant to get small solar panels that lit a small light bulb and powered a fan. And then students created scale drawings.
And I know Frank,
what your students can do. These were 6th graders, and they rose to the challenge and enjoyed doing that.
Awesome. And Frank, I know you also had some comments on this as well.
Yeah, so I mean, in the season of science fair, let's remember that you know, the White House has its science fair coming up in a couple days, and then one of the things that I know from my experience is coordinating and running science fairs with my students, and you know, especially at the high school level. You can do amazing projects. You need the time. You need a lot of time. But when students get to do science, and usually I worked with my students into teams. I wasn't a big fan of individual projects because it takes everything I do at NOAA and NASA for the last 20 years is all teamwork. And I think that the sooner we start working that way with our students, because the team of experts with different skills and capabilities and really can do amazing work, because that's what we're going to be doing here. So you know, from a project, there's so many different projects people can pick up on, whether it's on the engineering side, the science side, the observation side, the modeling side, or the social aspects. You know, but let them get into the real stuff. And that's really where the real project is, and that I found that opens up a lot of channels, and then also there are a lot of opportunities for students to differentiate themselves and show up when they go to apply for college or for wherever they are, and do science. There's no better way to learn it, and a lot of these projects we've already talked about do open up those opportunities, and scientists love working with students who really want to get into it and get better access to better tools or better data sets. So you know, I'm a huge fan of that. But you know, publishing papers and writing reports and sharing your findings, and then having teams pick that up. That's I mean, for me, that's where I take project based on.
And sorry to stop you. We're going to take one final question because we have 2 minutes, and I want to actually talk to Lisa. We had a lot of questions actually come in about introducing modeling to students, and I wonder if you could very quickly address like how you suggest people introduce climate modeling to their students.
Well, there are quite a few resources about this that maybe I'll have a way for you to post so that we can, you know, share some more of those. But there's been several teacher PD workshops recently on sharing the science of modeling. But I mean, one of the ways that I like to introduce modeling to folks is to take a physical model that they might know about, like a toy car, and say, is it a toy? Is it a car? And it is not a car, but it looks like a car. So we can say how it is like a car, how it is not like a car, and that's a physical model. That's, you know, not a giant computer model that is running, you know, thousands of calculations. But then we can make a really simple model with one calculation and say, if you put a number in one side, what do you get out the other side? Now, if you scale that up to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of calculations that are very complex, and sometimes at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, I see them written on whiteboards with, you know, all these weird symbols that I don't understand, and it's very, they're improving them all the time, but it's very complex, and that's why you need supercomputers to run them. But the idea of scaling that up from, I know what a model car is, I know what a toy car is, I know that is not an actual car, I also know that it approximates an actual car in certain ways. And so understanding what models are and how they are useful and also how they are not useful will help students understand what they can take away from it. That a model of the Earth is not an actual of the Earth, but it is a good approximation, and it's getting better all the time.
Awesome. Well, it's 8 o'clock, so it is time for us to close our discussion, but I wanted to thank all our panelists, Cheryl, Frank, Lisa, and Regina, for being with us for this Science Friday discussion on climate education. And each of our panelists has submitted a list of resources that they recommend for teachers, which includes professional development, data, a lot of the things that our questions were addressing today. So if you want to access those are on sciencefriday.com/climateclassroom. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our panelists again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.